You know, after all these years, you'd think I've seen every possible way a family can tear itself apart. But every now and then, a story walks onto my stage that isn't about yelling or cheating in the traditional sense. It's about silence. A silence so profound, so deeply rooted, that when it finally breaks, it shatters everything. That's the thing about secrets. They're not just the absence of truth. They are an active, living presence in a home. They take up space. They consume oxygen. And the bigger the secret, the more unstable the foundation of the family becomes, until one day the whole house just implodes. I remember the first time I saw the tape on Brenda. On the surface, she was the picture of suburban success. A loving husband, two bright, attractive teenagers, a son, Kyle, and a daughter, Jenna, a nice home, the whole 9 yards. She presented herself as an open book, the kind of mom who was her kid's best friend. But when I watched the pre-interview, I didn't see an open book. I saw a woman holding a book shut so tightly her knuckles were white. There was a brittleness to her smile, a flicker of panic in her eyes every time her kids spoke. She was playing a role, and the performance was getting exhausting. The problem, as the producers laid it out, was that Brenda's family had discovered she'd been lying to them for over 20 years. A massive, life-altering lie. The kids were devastated, feeling like their entire childhood was a fraud. Her son, Kyle, who was 19, was filled with a cold, quiet rage. He looked at his mother, not with the anger of a rebellious teen, but with the contempt of a betrayed adult. He said, "I don't know who she is. The woman who raised me doesn't exist." That's a powerful statement. When a child says that, you're not dealing with a simple disagreement, you're dealing with an identity crisis that the parent has inflicted upon them. His sister, Jenna, 17, was just lost. Her world had been turned upside down, and all she had was tears and confusion. She kept asking why, a question her mother seemed incapable of answering. The labels the family used were brutal: liar, manipulator, fake. They saw her actions as a selfish, calculated deception designed to protect herself. And from their point of view, they weren't wrong. The evidence was damning. But my job isn't to simply validate one side's perception of the evidence. My job is to understand the why. Behavior is driven by a payoff. People do what they do because it works for them on some level. It gets them something they want or protects them from something they fear. For Brenda, this wasn't about a payoff in the sense of gaining something. This was about avoiding a catastrophic loss. A loss so terrifying that she was willing to mortgage her family's entire emotional future to prevent it. When she walked out on that stage, the applause died down and you could feel the temperature in the room drop. She sat in that chair, and on one side were her children, looking at her like she was a stranger. She was trying to hold it together, to project an image of a mother in pain. But what I saw was a fugitive who had just been caught. There was fear, yes, but underneath it, there was almost a sense of relief. The kind of relief that comes when you've been running for 20 years and you just can't run another step. The truth was out. The bomb had gone off. Now, she had to stand in the wreckage and see if anything was salvageable, and that's where our work began. I wasn't there to condemn her. I was there to help her and her family understand how they ended up in this crater and if there was any way to climb out, because the truth, once it's out, is a powerful and dangerous thing. It can be a weapon or it can be a tool for healing. The choice of what it becomes was going to be made right there on my stage. To get to the heart of it, you have to peel back the layers. And with Brenda, there were 20 years of layers. I looked at her, then at her kids. The silence in that studio was heavy. It was the kind of silence that's full of noise, unspoken accusations, unanswered questions, a lifetime of hurt. I started simply. Brenda, I said, leaning forward, your children are here because they feel like the foundation of their lives has been washed away. They don't know who their mother is. So let's start there. Who are you? She took a shaky breath, the practiced composure starting to crack. I'm their mother. I love them more than anything. That's the first line of defense. It's true, I don't doubt she loved them, but it was also a deflection. It's an answer designed to elicit sympathy, not provide information. It wasn't going to work. I don't doubt that, I replied, keeping my tone even. But love and truth are two different things, and right now, they feel you've given them one without the other. Let's cut to the chase. What is the secret? What is the truth they found out? Her eyes darted to Kyle, then to Jenna. She was looking for an ally, a soft place to land, and finding none. Her son's face was stone. Her daughter was just weeping silently. This was her moment of reckoning. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. When I was 16, she began, her voice barely a whisper, I had a baby, a son. The air went out of the room. You could see Kyle flinch as if he'd been physically struck. Jenna's crying became a soft, choked gasp. This wasn't just a lie about her past. This was a person, a brother. I gave him up for adoption, she continued, the words tumbling out now. My family, they were very strict, very religious. This was the ultimate shame. It was handled. He was taken, and I was told to never speak of it again. To pretend it never happened, there it was, the origin story. This wasn't just her secret, it was a secret forced upon her, a toxic inheritance from her own family. She learned a critical, life-altering lesson at 16. The way to deal with shame is to bury it. The way to survive a catastrophe is to pretend it never existed. And that lesson became the operating system for the rest of her life. So you didn't just give up a child. I clarified, making sure everyone understood the mechanics of this. You gave up a life. You gave up your name. You moved away. You essentially erased the girl you were and invented Brenda. She nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. I had to. I wanted a clean slate. I wanted a normal life. I met my husband, and I never told him. I couldn't. How could I tell this wonderful man that I was damaged goods, that I had this horrible secret? This is a critical psychological junction. She created a narrative in her head that the real her was unlovable. The real her was shameful. So, to earn love and acceptance, she had to perform as someone else. The problem is, when you do that, you can never truly accept the love you receive because you believe it's directed at a fictional character. Every I love you from her husband, every hug from her children felt fraudulent to her on some deep subconscious level because they didn't know who they were loving. That creates a profound sense of isolation even when you're in a house full of people. I turned my attention to the kids. Kyle, Jenna, I said softly, this is obviously a shock. How did you find out? It was Kyle who answered, his voice tight with anger. We were looking for some old photos in the attic. We found a box. It had her old name on it. There was a diary and letters from her mother, talking about the situation and how glad she was it was resolved. The words dripped with sarcasm. He had stumbled upon the evidence of the crime, the proof that the life he knew was a carefully constructed stage play. This wasn't just about a long-lost brother. It was about the totality of the deception, the family trees they'd drawn in elementary school, the questions about grandparents and cousins, Every story she told them about her childhood was either a complete fabrication or a heavily edited version of the truth. They were mourning the loss of their history. Their roots had been severed. For Jenna, the pain was more personal. Did you ever think about him? She asked her mom, her voice trembling, "Did you ever wonder where he was?" And that was the question that hung in the air. Because for Brenda to maintain her new life, she had to perform a psychological amputation. She had to sever the part of herself that was a mother to another child. She had to actively suppress any thought, any memory, any grief. She built a dam inside her mind. And for 20 years, she stood guard, plugging every tiny leak. But a dam like that requires constant energy. It requires hypervigilance. It's exhausting, and it meant a part of her heart was always walled off, inaccessible to the very children she was trying to build a perfect life for. They couldn't have known what was behind the wall, but they could feel the wall. They could feel the distance. They just never knew why. The discovery in the attic wasn't just a discovery, it was a detonation. And the fallout was immediate and catastrophic. I asked Kyle, "What happened right after you found the box? What did you do?" He looked at his mother, a fresh wave of anger crossing his face. We confronted her. We came downstairs holding the diary. I looked at her and said, "Who is Sarah?" That was her name, the name in the diary. You have to picture this scene. Brenda is in her kitchen, maybe making dinner, living the life she so carefully constructed. And her two children walk in, holding the ghost of her past in their hands. The very thing she had spent 2 decades running from was now standing in her living room. Her carefully built dam didn't just leak, it burst. What was her reaction, I asked. Jenna spoke this time, wiping her eyes. She just collapsed. She started crying and saying she was sorry over and over again. But she wouldn't explain. She just kept saying, I can't talk about it. It was like she was still trying to keep the secret even after it was out. This is a classic trauma response. For Brenda, the secret was so deeply intertwined with shame and fear that even with the evidence in front of her, her programming kicked in. Do not speak, do not admit. To speak is to die. Her brain was screaming danger, even though the threat was no longer her parents' disapproval, but the loss of her children's trust. This is where the escalation began. The kid's initial shock and confusion quickly curdled into anger. Why? Because her continued silence felt like a continuation of the lie. It felt like she wasn't sorry she lied, she was just sorry she got caught. Kyle described the following weeks as a living hell. Everything became a lie, he said, his voice flat. We'd ask her about a vacation we took, and we'd be thinking, was that real, or were you just playing the part of happy mom? I looked at pictures of us as kids, and all I could see was this stranger smiling back. He started pulling away, spending more and more time out of the house. He stopped talking to her. The silence he gave her was a weapon, a mirror of the silence she had given him and his sister their whole lives. It was his way of saying, see how it feels to be shut out, to live with a ghost? That's not a conscious, strategic decision on a kid's part. It's an instinctive, painful reaction. He was trying to hurt her the way she had hurt him. Jenna, being younger and perhaps more emotionally volatile, reacted differently. She went from crying to screaming. She would follow her mother around the house, demanding answers. Why didn't you trust us? Did you think we would hate you? Don't you know us at all? These are legitimate, soul-searing questions. The irony is, Brenda's entire deception was built on the premise that the truth would destroy her family, but it was the deception itself that was doing the destroying. The truth might have been painful, but it could have been processed. A lie, once discovered, poisons everything retroactively. Brenda, for her part, was drowning. She was trapped in the very pattern she'd learned as a teenager. When confronted with an overwhelming emotional crisis, she shut down. She retreated. She described it as being in a fog. I wanted to tell them everything she said to me on stage, her voice pleading, but the words wouldn't come out. It was like my throat was closing up. All I could feel was this suffocating shame, the same shame I felt when I was 16. This is where you see the blame shifting, not in an aggressive way, but in a passive, victimized way. She wasn't blaming her kids, but she was blaming her past, her parents, her circumstances. You don't understand what it was like back then, she would say to them. And while that was true, it was also irrelevant to her children's pain. They weren't asking for a history lesson. They were asking for their mother to be accountable in the here and now. Her inability to move past her own trauma made it impossible for her to attend to theirs. The family home became a pressure cooker of resentment, silent treatments, and tearful, unresolved arguments. Her husband was caught in the middle, trying to broker a peace that was impossible because the fundamental issue, the broken trust, was never being addressed. He loved his wife, but he saw the profound damage done to his children. That's why they ended up on my show. They had reached a complete and total impasse. The family was dying. They were there as a last resort, hoping for a miracle or at the very least, a final verdict. Word count 1000. When you have a family in this much pain, sitting just feet apart but emotionally miles away, you have to be very deliberate. You can't just let them relitigate the same failed arguments they've been having in their living room. My role in that moment is to disrupt the pattern. I had to get past the what and drill down to the why, but not just Brenda's why. I had to address the kids' why. Why did this betrayal cut so deep? I turned to Kyle. His arms were crossed, a wall of teenage defiance and hurt. He was the angriest, and in a situation like this, the angriest person is often the one who is in the most pain. Kyle, I said, my voice firm but not accusatory. I want you to look at your mother. Not the woman you think is a liar. Look at your mom. And I want you to tell her, right now, what is the single most painful part of this for you? Not the lie itself, the impact of the lie. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. For a second, I thought he was going to refuse. But then something in his posture shifted. The anger was still there, but it was joined by a profound sadness. The most painful part, he said, his voice cracking for the first time, is that my whole life I felt like something was missing. Like there was this sadness in you that I could never fix. I thought it was me. I thought I wasn't a good enough son. I spent my entire childhood trying to make you happy, trying to get you to really see me. And now I know why you couldn't. You were too busy hiding. You weren't there. A part of you was always somewhere else with him. Boom. There it was, the breakthrough. It wasn't about the existence of a brother. It was about his own existence. He had spent his life interpreting his mother's hidden grief as his own failure. He had personalized her distance. He had carried the burden of her secret without ever knowing what it was. He had shouldered the responsibility for her happiness, a weight no child should ever have to bear. This lie hadn't just deprived him of a brother, it had deprived him of a fully present mother, and in doing so, had damaged his own sense of self-worth. I let that hang in the air for a moment. I looked at Brenda. Her face was a mask of anguish. She wasn't just hearing his anger now. She was hearing his pain. The pain she had inadvertently caused in her desperate attempt to protect herself and her perfect family. She had been so focused on the shame of her past that she had been completely blind to the damage her coping mechanism was inflicting in the present. I turned to Jenna. Jenna, what about you? What are you feeling? She was still crying, but her tears seemed different now, less about confusion and more about a deep, resonant sorrow. I just feel so alone, she whispered. My mom was my best friend. I told her everything. And the whole time she was holding this huge piece of her life back from me, it makes me question everything. When I cried over a boy, was she really listening or was she thinking about something else? It feels like our whole relationship was one-sided. The core issue was now laid bare. This was a crisis of authenticity. Brenda had created a family that was technically real. They lived in the same house, ate the same meals, shared a last name, but it was emotionally fraudulent. The intimacy was counterfeit because it was incomplete, and the kids, now that they knew, felt the sting of that counterfeit connection. They were grieving not just the lie, but the lost opportunity for a genuine, whole relationship with their mother. This was the moment of confrontation, not me confronting Brenda, but Brenda confronting the true consequences of her choices. Brenda, I said, leaning in, do you hear what your children are saying? This isn't just about a secret you kept. This is about the emotional vacancy it created in your home. Your son thought your sadness was his fault. Your daughter thinks her best friend was a stranger. You were so terrified of the truth of your past that you became a ghost in your present. You talk about shame. The shame of being a 16-year-old girl in a terrible situation. But I want to ask you, what about the shame of right now? The shame of sitting here and realizing that in an effort to not be rejected for who you were, you are being rejected for who you are. You traded one fear for another. She broke. Not in a theatrical way, but in a deep, soul-shattering way. The kind of crying that comes from the bottom of your feet. The wall was down. The fugitive was done running. All the energy she had spent for 20 years holding that dam in place was gone, and all that was left was the raw, painful truth. I'm so sorry, she sobbed, looking at her children, really looking at them. I never thought of it that way. I was just so scared. I didn't want to lose you, and now I have. I've lost you anyway. No, Kyle said, his voice thick with emotion. You haven't lost us. We're right here. We've been here the whole time waiting for you. That was the turning point. The shift from accusation to a shared, agonizing recognition of the truth. The problem wasn't the baby she had had at 16. The problem was the secret. And for the first time in that moment, the secret was no longer in control. They were. The aftermath of a breakthrough like that is a fragile thing. It's like the air after a massive thunderstorm. It's clean, but the ground is soaked, and there's debris everywhere. The confrontation on stage had shattered the dynamic of blame and defense, but it didn't magically fix 2 decades of a dysfunctional pattern. The real work, as I told them, was just beginning. Healing isn't a moment, it's a process. I laid out a very clear path forward for them, not just for Brenda, but for the entire family system. Because a secret like this doesn't just infect one person, it creates roles for everyone. Brenda was the keeper of the secret. Her children became unwitting detectives of her moods, trying to solve the mystery of their mother's emotional distance. Her husband became the peacemaker, trying to smooth over the cracks he couldn't see the source of. Everyone had a part to play in the family drama, and now the play was over. They needed a new script. For Brenda, the first step was radical, gut-wrenching honesty, starting with herself. I told her, you have to stop seeing that 16-year-old girl as shameful. You need to go back and forgive her. She was a child in an impossible situation who did what she was told to do by the adults who were supposed to protect her. She survived. She didn't do something wrong. Something wrong was done to her. You have carried this burden of shame that was never yours to carry. It was your parents' shame. It was society's shame. You were just the one left holding the bag. This was crucial. As long as she saw her younger self as damaged goods, she would never be able to present her whole self to her family. She had to integrate that part of her story not as a source of shame, but as a source of strength. She had survived something profound. She had to learn to own her entire story, the painful parts included, and stop apologizing for its existence. This would require intensive individual therapy. She had to unpack 20 years of suppressed grief, not just for the son she gave up, but for the girl she had to abandon in order to become the Brenda everyone knew. For the children, Kyle and Jenna, their task was different. They had to grieve. They had to grieve the childhood they thought they had. They had to grieve the loss of their mother's perceived perfection and accept the flawed, complicated, and more authentic woman who was sitting in front of them. Your anger is justified, I told them. It's the shield that protected your heart when it was broken. But you can't live behind that shield forever. At some point, you have to decide if you want to be right or if you want to have a relationship with your mother. I also made it clear that their healing was their responsibility too. They couldn't use her past lie as a weapon to control or punish her for the rest of her life. They had a choice. They could either hold on to the resentment and let it define their family's future, or they could work through the pain and build something new, something honest, on the wreckage of the old foundation. This would mean family therapy, a neutral space where they could have the hard conversations they couldn't have at the kitchen table, with a professional to guide them. And what about the big question? The other son, the brother. I addressed this head on. Brenda, you have a decision to make. You can't put this genie back in the bottle. Your children know they have a half-brother. This isn't just your story anymore, it's theirs too. I advised her that the decision of whether or not to search for him had to be a family decision made when they were on more solid emotional ground. To rush into a search while the family was still in crisis would be like trying to perform surgery on a moving train. It would add another layer of immense emotional complexity to an already overloaded system. First, they had to heal the family they had. They needed to learn how to be a family of four again, but this time, an honest one. When we left the stage, the tension was gone, replaced by a heavy, somber sense of reality. There were no magic hugs, no tearful promises that everything would be perfect. That's not real life. What I saw was a family that was finally, for the first time, looking at each other without the filter of a secret. They looked exhausted, raw, and profoundly sad. But they also looked like they were on the same page, standing in the same wreckage for the first time. The outcome was not guaranteed. Trust, once shattered, is not easily rebuilt. It requires thousands of moments of consistency and truthfulness to patch even a small crack. I followed up with them, of course. The first few months were incredibly difficult. Brenda started therapy and, as she put it, cried for 20 years. She was excavating a lifetime of buried pain. The family sessions were rocky. Kyle would revert to anger. Jenna would retreat into tears. But they kept showing up. That's the key. They kept doing the work. Brenda started practicing small acts of honesty. She told them stories from her real childhood about the girl named Sarah. She shared her fears, her regrets, her pain, without deflection or justification. She was replacing the old, fraudulent narrative with a new, true one, piece by piece. She was showing them who she was, and they were cautiously, slowly beginning to listen. There was no overnight transformation. It was a slow, painful crawl toward a new normal. But about a year later, I got a letter from Brenda. It included a family photo. They were standing on a beach, and for the first time, the smile in Brenda's eyes matched the smile on her lips. It was genuine. She wrote that the silence in their house was gone. It had been replaced by conversation, sometimes difficult, sometimes painful, but always real. Kyle was in college and called her every week. Jenna was applying to schools and asked for her mom's advice on everything. She said they hadn't yet decided about searching for her first son. They agreed they weren't ready, but they were talking about it openly and honestly as a family. That, to me, is a successful outcome. It's not a Hollywood ending where everyone is perfectly healed and all problems are solved. It's a real life ending. It's about a family that was on the brink of disintegration who chose to do the hard work of rebuilding. Brenda learned that the love her family had for her was not contingent on her perfection. It was strong enough to withstand the truth. And her children learned that their mother was not a monster or a liar, but a flawed human being who made a desperate choice a long time ago and then spent half her life trying to outrun it. They didn't get a new past, but they fought like hell for a new future. And that's about as much as you can ask for. Looking back on Brenda's story, it serves as a powerful reminder of a fundamental truth I've seen play out time and time again. You are only as sick as your secrets. The very act of hiding something toxic creates a toxic environment. Brenda thought she was containing a poison, but in reality, she was letting it seep into the very foundations of her family's emotional well-being. The energy it takes to maintain a lie of that magnitude over 2 decades is astronomical. It's a full-time job. It's a thief that steals your mental and emotional resources, leaving you depleted and unable to be fully present for the people you love the most. Think about the cognitive load she was carrying every single day. Every casual question about her past had to be filtered through the lie. Every story had to be checked for consistency. She was living with a constant, low-grade fear of exposure. That kind of chronic stress changes a person. It creates a hypervigilance, a guardedness that other people can feel even if they can't name it. Her children felt it. They grew up with a mother who was, in a very real sense, emotionally holding her breath. And when a parent is holding their breath, the children learn not to breathe too deeply themselves. It creates an atmosphere of unspoken tension, a sense that something is off, that the ground beneath their feet isn't entirely solid. Kyle's reaction was a textbook example of how a child personalizes a parent's unexplained pain. Kids are inherently egocentric. They believe the world revolves around them. So if a parent is sad or distant or angry, the child's first assumption is, it must be my fault. I did something wrong. I am not enough. Kyle spent 19 years trying to be enough for his mother, trying to solve a puzzle that he didn't have all the pieces to. The damage that does to a young person's self-esteem is profound. He was carrying a burden that wasn't his, and the anger he felt upon discovering the truth was not just about the lie. It was the righteous anger of someone who realizes they've been forced to carry an invisible weight their entire life. Jenna's experience of the betrayal was a crisis of intimacy. The mother-daughter bond, especially in the teenage years, is often built on a foundation of shared secrets and confidences. Jenna believed she had that. She believed her mother was her safe harbor, the one person she could tell anything to. The revelation that her mother had a secret life of her own, a life so significant it was never shared, completely invalidated that sense of safety. It made her question her own judgment. If she couldn't see this massive truth about her own mother, what else was she not seeing? It shatters a young person's confidence in their ability to perceive reality accurately. The family dynamic itself was a classic enmeshed yet disconnected system. They were enmeshed because Brenda's secret dictated everyone's emotional state, even without their knowledge. They were disconnected because the secret prevented genuine, authentic connection. It was a paradox that left everyone feeling confused and isolated. The husband, trying to be the supportive spouse, was essentially enabling the secret by not questioning the emotional distance he must have felt from his wife. He was playing his part in maintaining the family's fragile homeostasis. When the truth came out, it didn't just disrupt Brenda's world, it disrupted the role every single person played in the family. That's why the healing had to be a family-wide effort. You can't just treat the person who kept the secret. You have to treat the system that the secret created. The decision not to immediately search for the other son was, in my opinion, one of the wisest choices they made in the aftermath. It demonstrated a newfound maturity and a respect for the healing process. Finding him would not be a magic solution. It would be the beginning of an entirely new, incredibly complex chapter with its own set of potential traumas and challenges. He is a person, not a concept. He has a life, a family, and a story of his own that may or may not have room for them. To initiate that contact before their own family unit was stable would have been reckless. They recognized that they needed to fix their own house before inviting a stranger in, no matter how intimately he was related to their past. Ultimately, Brenda's story isn't about the shame of teenage pregnancy. It's about the corrosive power of shame itself. Shame is what drove her to create a new identity. Shame is what kept her silent for 20 years. Shame is what prevented her from being a whole person to her own children. And it was only when she was able to face that shame head on my stage, and see it reflected in the pain of her children, that she could begin to dismantle it. The breakthrough wasn't just admitting the truth, it was recognizing that the consequences of the secret were far more damaging than the consequences of the truth ever could have been. The truth, as painful as it was, carried with it the possibility of healing and reconnection. The secret offered only the certainty of continued isolation and eventual collapse. They chose the painful possibility of hope over the false comfort of a lie. And in the world of family dynamics, that choice is everything.